The warm summer evening in London had been perfect for celebrating, and Tommy Walsh was making the most of it. The 32-year-old construction worker from Dublin had come to London with his mates for his bachelor party weekend, and they had spent the better part of the day sampling every pub between Westminster and Buckingham. Palace Tommy wasn't usually much of a drinker, but this was a special occasion. In 2 weeks he would be marrying his longtime girlfriend Sarah, and his friends had insisted that his last weekend of freedom needed to be legendary. What had started as a few pints at lunch had turned into an all-day crawl through London's most famous drinking establishments. By evening, Tommy's group had dwindled from 8 rowdy Irishmen to just 3. The others had either passed out in various hotel rooms or had been escorted back to their accommodations by more responsible friends. Tommy, however, was still going strong, fueled by liquid courage and the excitement of being in one of the world's most famous cities. "Come on, lads." Tommy slurred as he stumbled along the sidewalk near Horse Guards Parade, his arm draped over his best man's shoulder. The night is still young. You haven't even seen the Queen yet. His remaining companions, Declan and Mick, were slightly more sober and significantly more sensible. They had been trying to steer Tommy back toward their hotel for the past hour. Well, the groom-to-be seemed determined to squeeze every ounce of adventure out of his London experience. "Tommy, mate," Declan said, his own words slightly slurred, but his thinking still somewhat clear. "Maybe we should call it a night. You're getting married in 2 weeks. Sarah will kill both of us if we let you get arrested in London." But Tommy was beyond listening to reason. The alcohol had stripped away his usual caution and replaced it with an inflated sense of invincibility. He had spent his entire adult life following rules, working hard, and being responsible. Tonight he felt like he could do anything. As they rounded a corner, Tommy's bleary eyes focused on something that made him stop dead in his tracks. There, standing in perfect formation, were 2 mounted royal guards on their magnificent horses. The soldiers sat ramrod straight in their saddles, their red tunics and plumed helmets creating an impressive sight against the backdrop of the historic buildings. The horses were beautiful creatures, standing at least 16 hands high with glossy coats and intelligent eyes. They had been specially trained for ceremonial duties and were accustomed to crowds, cameras, and the general chaos that surrounded tourist attractions. However, they were also working animals with their own personalities and instincts. Tommy's alcohol-addled brain immediately began formulating what seemed like a brilliant idea. Back home in Dublin, he had grown up around horses. His grandfather had owned a small farm, and Tommy had learned to ride as a child. Of course, that had been over 20 years ago, and he had never attempted to mount a horse while drunk. But these details seemed unimportant at the moment. "Look at that," Tommy announced loudly, pointing at the mounted guards. "Those horses are gorgeous. It's just like the ones back home." The guards, as trained, remained motionless and silent. They had dealt with drunk tourists before, and their protocol was to ignore minor disturbances unless they escalated into actual threats. The horses, meanwhile, stood calmly but alertly, their ears twitching at the sound of Tommy's loud voice. "I bet I could ride one of those beauties," Tommy continued, his voice growing more confident with each word. "I learned to ride when I was just a wee lad. My grandfather always said I had a natural seat." Declan and Mick exchanged worried glances. They knew that look in Tommy's eyes. It was the same expression he had worn just before he had tried to climb Nelson's column earlier in the day, or when he had challenged a street performer to a dance-off outside Covent Garden. "Tommy, no," Mick said firmly, grabbing his friend's arm. "Those are working soldiers, not a petting zoo, Dan. And those horses are probably trained to kick troublemakers into next week." What? Tommy was already walking toward the horses, his construction worker's swagger made even more pronounced by the alcohol coursing through his system. He had convinced himself that this would be the perfect capstone to his bachelor party weekend, a story that would be told at Irish pubs for years to come. "Don't worry about me, lads," Tommy called over his shoulder. "I know what I'm doing. These London horses can't be any different from the ones back home. Besides, what's the worst that could happen?" As Tommy approached the first horse, the magnificent black mare named Britannia, she turned her head slightly to observe this loud, stumbling human who reeked of alcohol and poor decisions. Her years of training had taught her to remain calm in most situations, but her instincts were already telling her that this particular tourist was going to be trouble. Britannia was a 7-year-old Irish sport horse who had been serving in the household cavalry for 3 years. She had been carefully selected for her calm temperament, intelligence, and ability to handle the unpredictable nature of ceremonial duties in central London. Every day, she dealt with camera flashes, loud tourists, traffic noise, the occasional child who tried to pet her legs. However, nothing in her extensive training had quite prepared her for Tommy Walsh. The horse's rider, Trooper James Harrison, felt Britannia's muscles tense slightly as the drunk Irishman approached. Harrison had been serving as a mounted guard for 2 years and had developed an almost telepathic connection with his horse. He could sense her growing unease, though his training required him to remain motionless and silent unless the situation escalated to a genuine security threat. Tommy stumbled closer, his eyes fixed on Britannia, with the kind of determined focus that only very drunk people possess. In his alcohol-clouded judgment, he had convinced himself that approaching a working military horse was not only acceptable, but actually a friendly gesture that the animal would appreciate.
"Hello there, beautiful," Tommy said in what he believed
Was a soothing voice, but which actually came out as a loud, slurred greeting that made Britannia's ears flatten slightly against her head. "You remind me of my grandfather's horse, Molly. She was a grand old girl, just like you." Britannia had excellent hearing and could detect the distinct smell of alcohol emanating from this strange human. Horses are naturally wary of unpredictable behavior. Kay and Tommy's unsteady movements and loud voice were triggering all of her warning instincts. Tommy reached out his hand toward Britannia's nose, intending to pet her in what he remembered as the proper way to greet a horse. However, his coordination was severely impaired, and his gesture was more of a clumsy swipe than a gentle approach. "Easy, girl," Tommy continued, completely misreading the horse's body language. Britannia had taken a small step backward and was showing clear signs of discomfort, but Tommy interpreted this as playful behavior rather than a warning. Trooper Harrison remained at attention, but was carefully monitoring the situation. His training covered various scenarios involving difficult tourists, and he was prepared to act if necessary. However, protocol dictated that he should allow the situation to develop unless it became an immediate threat to public safety or military security. Tommy's friends had finally caught up to him and were now standing at what they hoped was a safe distance, ready to intervene if their friend's stupidity reached dangerous levels. "Tommy, get away from there!" Declan called out, his own intoxication not preventing him from recognizing a potentially disastrous situation. "That horse is bigger than you are, and it's got a soldier on its back." But Tommy was too focused on what he saw as his moment of triumph to listen to his friend's warnings. The alcohol had convinced him that he possessed some kind of magical connection with animals, and he was determined to prove his horse-handling skills to anyone who was watching. "Watch this, lads," Tommy announced proudly. "I'm going to show these London horses what real Irish horsemanship looks like." Without warning, Tommy lunged forward and grabbed Britannia's reins with both hands. The sudden movement and the grip on her equipment sent an immediate signal to the well-trained horse that something was very wrong. Britannia's head jerked upward, lifting Tommy's feet completely off the ground for a moment. The horse's powerful neck muscles could easily support his weight, but the sudden grab had startled her and activated her defensive instincts.
"Whoa," Tommy laughed, thinking this was all part of the fun. "She's got some spirit, just like the horses back home."
Tommy failed to understand was that Britannia wasn't playing or showing spirit. She was displaying the measured response of a highly trained military horse who was attempting to maintain her composure while dealing with an unpredictable threat. "Trooper." Harrison felt his horse's distress through the saddle and made a subtle adjustment to his seat, preparing for whatever might happen next. His years of training had taught him to trust his horse's instincts completely, but Britannia was clearly communicating that this situation was escalating beyond her comfort zone. Tommy, meanwhile, had interpreted the horse's reaction as encouragement. In his drunken state, he had convinced himself that Britannia was inviting him to attempt something that no sober person would ever consider: trying to mount a working military horse while its rider was still in the saddle. The moment Tommy released Britannia's reins and stepped back to survey his next move, A small crowd of tourists began to gather. Word had spread quickly through the evening sightseers that something entertaining was happening near the horse guards, and phones were already being pulled out to record whatever was about to unfold. Tommy stood swaying slightly, his construction worker's confidence amplified by alcohol and the growing audience. He had always been something of a show-off, and the combination of drinks and spectators was proving irresistible to his ego. Right then, Tommy announced loudly enough for everyone to hear, "Time to show you all how we do things in Ireland." Britannia watched this loud, unpredictable human with growing concern. Her training had taught her to tolerate many types of behavior, but Tommy's erratic movements and strong alcohol smell were triggering every instinct that told her to be cautious around potential threats. Tommy began circling the horse, looking for what he imagined would be the best approach for mounting. His alcohol-impaired brain had somehow convinced him that climbing onto a 17-hand military horse while its rider was still mounted was not only possible but actually a clever idea that would impress everyone watching. The trick, Tommy explained to his horrified friends in the gathering crowd, is to approach from the left side. That's how my grandfather taught me. Always mount from the near side, he said. Trooper Harrison remained at perfect attention, but his experienced eye was tracking Tommy's every movement. The soldier's training included procedures for dealing with various types of public disturbances. He was mentally preparing for several possible scenarios. Tommy approached Britannia's left side with the exaggerated confidence of someone who had consumed far too much alcohol. His movements were uncoordinated and unpredictable, exactly the kind of behavior that made horses nervous. "Easy, girl," Tommy slurred, reaching out to grab the stirrup that was currently occupied by Trooper Harrison's polished boot. "Just going to hop on up here for a quick ride around the block?" The moment Tommy's hands made contact with the stirrup, several things happened simultaneously. Britannia felt the unfamiliar touch and pressure on her tack. Trooper Harrison felt his stirrup being pulled by an unauthorized person, and the growing crowd of tourists collectively held their breath in anticipation of disaster. "I must ask you to step away from the horse," Trooper Harrison said firmly, breaking his ceremonial silence for the first time. His voice carried the unmistakable authority of military training. But Tommy was too drunk and too committed to his performance to heed the warning. "Don't worry, mate," Tommy replied cheerfully, completely misunderstanding the seriousness of the situation. "I know what I'm doing. Used to ride all the time back home." With that declaration, Tommy attempted to place his foot in the stirrup alongside the trooper's boot. The awkward angle, his impaired balance, and the sheer impossibility of what he was trying to accomplish created a perfect storm of inevitable failure. Britannia felt the additional weight, pressure on her stirrup, and immediately knew that something was very wrong. This wasn't the familiar weight and balance of her trained rider. This was chaotic, uneven pressure that threatened her stability and the safety of everyone involved. Tommy managed to get his foot partially into the stirrup before physics and common sense caught up with him. His attempt to pull himself upward, while maintaining his grip, resulted in him dangling awkwardly from the side of a very large, very patient, but increasingly agitated military horse. "Almost got it." Tommy grunted, his face red with exertion as he tried to swing his other leg over Britannia's back. The crowd watched in fascination and horror as this drunk tourist attempted something that violated every rule of common sense, military protocol, and basic horse safety. Britannia had reached the limit of her considerable patience. Her training told her to remain calm, but her instincts were screaming that this situation had gone too far. The unpredictable weight hanging from her side was affecting her balance, and the strange human's movements were becoming more frantic and dangerous by the second. Trooper Harrison made a quick decision based on his assessment of the escalating situation. His horse was becoming distressed. A civilian was putting himself and others at risk, and the situation was rapidly moving beyond the bounds of what could be safely ignored. "Security," he called out, his voice cutting through the evening air with military precision. "I need assistance at Post 7 immediately." But Tommy was too focused on his increasingly desperate attempt to mount the horse to hear the call for backup. He was determined to complete his self-appointed mission. Even as Britannia began to shift her weight and move in ways that clearly indicated she had had enough of this particular tourist's attention. Britannia had been trained to handle many challenging situations, but a drunk Irishman attempting to climb onto her back while she was already carrying her rider was testing the limits of her professional patience. Yes, the well-trained mare decided it was time to take matters into her own hooves, with the kind of calculated precision that only comes from years of military training. Britannia began to execute what horse trainers call evasive maneuvers. These weren't the wild, panicked movements of a frightened animal, rather the deliberate actions of a highly intelligent horse who had decided that enough was enough. First, she took several quick, precise steps to the right, causing Tommy's precarious grip on her stirrup to become even more unstable. His feet scrambled for purchase on the cobblestones as he tried to maintain his hold. But Britannia's smooth, calculated movement had thrown off his already impaired balance. "Whoa there, girl," Tommy called out, still thinking this was all part of some grand adventure. "Just hold still for a second while I get my bearings." But Britannia had no intention of holding still. Phase 2 of her plan involved a technique that cavalry horses had been using for centuries to discourage unwanted passengers: the strategic shoulder check. With perfect timing, Britannia shifted her considerable weight and gently but firmly bumped Tommy with her shoulder. The movement was controlled and measured, not enough to seriously hurt him, but certainly enough to communicate that his presence was no longer welcome. Tommy staggered backward, his grip on the stirrup finally broken. He windmilled his arms, wildly trying to regain his balance, while the crowd of tourists watched with a mixture of amusement and concern. "She's got personality, this one," Tommy announced to the crowd, apparently interpreting Britannia's clear rejection as playful behavior. "Just like the horses back home, they like to test you before they accept you as their rider." Trooper Harrison could feel his horse's tension through the saddle and recognized that Britannia was displaying remarkable restraint given the circumstances. A less well-trained animal might have reared or bolted, but his mount was handling the situation with the professionalism expected of the household cavalry. Tommy, however, was far from finished. The alcohol in his system had convinced him that Britannia's evasive actions were actually a form of equine flirtation, and he was more determined than ever to complete his self-appointed mission. "Round 2, Tommy announced, approaching Britannia. "From a different angle, this time I'll try the mounting technique my cousin Sean taught me." Britannia watched Tommy's approach with a kind of weary resignation that suggested she was already planning her next defensive move. Her ears flicked back and forth as she calculated the best response to this persistently annoying human. This time, Tommy attempted a running mount, a technique that might have worked with a cooperative horse and a sober rider, but which was doomed to failure under the current circumstances. He took several unsteady steps backward, then charged forward with the intention of leaping onto Britannia's back in one heroic motion. Britannia saw him coming and employed a defensive strategy that would have made her military trainers proud. At the exact moment Tommy launched himself toward her back, she took a single, perfectly timed step forward. Tommy's trajectory, which had been aimed at Britannia's back, suddenly found nothing but empty air. His momentum carried him past the horse entirely, and he landed in an undignified heap on the cobblestones on the other side. The crowd erupted in applause and laughter, clearly impressed by the horse's tactical superiority over the determined but hopelessly outmatched tourist. Several people were recording the entire incident on their phones, and Tommy's failed mounting attempt was already being uploaded to social media, with captions like "Horse versus drunk tourist, horse wins. La la la." Tommy lay on the ground for a moment, staring up at the London sky and trying to process what had just happened. The landing had knocked some of the wind out of him, but his pride was hurt more than his body. "She's smarter than she looks," Tommy admitted grudgingly, as he slowly picked himself up from the cobblestones. "But I'm not giving up yet." Britannia looked down at this persistent human with what could only be described as equine exasperation. Her body language clearly communicated that she had tried to be polite about ending this interaction. But if Tommy insisted on continuing his foolish behavior, she was prepared to escalate her defensive measures accordingly. As Tommy dusted off his clothes and prepared for what he was already calling round 3 in his alcohol-ladled mind, Tanya decided that subtlety was clearly not working with this particular human. The intelligent mare had tried polite evasion and strategic movement, but Tommy seemed determined to interpret every defensive action as encouragement. It was time for more direct communication. Tommy approached Britannia again, this time with what he believed was a more cunning strategy. The problem, he explained loudly to his mortified friends and the growing crowd of spectators, is that I've been treating her like a regular horse. But this is a royal horse. She probably expects more formal manners, with exaggerated ceremony. Tommy removed his baseball cap and attempted an awkward bow toward Britannia. The gesture would have been comical under normal circumstances, but his impaired balance turned it into a stumbling near fall that required him to grab onto a nearby lamppost for support. "Your Majesty," Tommy slurred, addressing the horse with mock formality, "I humbly request permission to board your magnificent vessel for a brief tour of the premises." Britannia's response was swift and decisive. The moment Tommy stepped within range, she turned her head and delivered what equestrians call a warning nip, a quick, precise pinch that was more communication than aggression, but which carried a very clear message: stay away. The nip caught Tommy's sleeve and pulled him forward slightly, causing him to stumble into Britannia's shoulder. The contact between drunk tourist and patient military horse resulted in Tommy bouncing backward like he had walked into a furry wall. "She's trying to kiss me," Tommy announced to the crowd, completely misinterpreting Britannia's warning as affection. "I knew we'd become friends eventually." Trooper Harrison had reached the end of his considerable patience. His horse was showing admirable restraint, but the situation was escalating beyond what could be safely ignored. More importantly, backup security was taking longer to arrive than expected, and Tommy's behavior was becoming more erratic by the minute. "Sir," Trooper Harrison said in his most authoritative voice, "you need to step away from my horse immediately. This is your final warning before I'm forced to take official action." But Tommy was in the grip of what psychologists call alcohol-induced overconfidence, a condition that makes people believe they can accomplish things that are clearly impossible. The trooper's warning only seemed to encourage him further. "Don't worry, soldier," Tommy called up to the mounted guard. "I'm practically a professional. My grandfather bred horses for the Irish military back in the day. This is in my blood." Tommy's next attempt at mounting Britannia was his most ambitious yet. He had noticed a small mounting block nearby that was used by the guards for ceremonial purposes, and his intoxicated brain had seized upon it as the solution to his mounting problems. "Aha!" Tommy exclaimed, pointing at the block with the triumph of someone who believed they had just solved a complex puzzle. "That's what I've been missing. Proper equipment." He staggered toward the mounting block, dragging it closer to Britannia, despite its considerable weight. The scraping sound of stone against cobblestones created an unpleasant noise that made several tourists cover their ears and caused Britannia's ears to flatten against her head in annoyance. Tommy climbed onto the mounting block with the careful movements of someone trying very hard not to fall over. From this elevated position, he was now roughly at the same height as Britannia's back, and he could see Trooper Harrison's face clearly for the first time. "Evening, mate," Tommy said cheerfully, apparently not noticing the soldier's expression of barely controlled professional frustration. "Mind if I ride along? I promise I won't be any trouble." Britannia had been watching Tommy's preparations with the kind of focused attention that prey animals develop when they're calculating the exact moment to flee from a predator. She had tolerated his previous attempts with remarkable patience, but the mounting block represented a genuine escalation in the threat. Level as Tommy prepared to launch himself from the block toward her back, Britannia made a decision that would be talked about in cavalry circles for months to come. She was going to demonstrate exactly why attempting to mount a military horse without permission was such a spectacularly bad idea. The moment Tommy leaned forward to begin his jump, Britannia executed a maneuver that was part military precision, in part natural horse instinct. She took 2 quick steps sideways, leaving Tommy committed to a jump that would land him exactly nowhere near his intended target. Tommy's leap from the mounting block was executed with all the grace and precision of a drunk construction worker attempting aerial acrobatics. For a brief moment, he sailed through the London evening air with his arms outstretched, looking like a very confused superhero whose powers had suddenly abandoned him. Britannia's perfectly timed sidestep meant that Tommy's ambitious jump landed him not on the back of a royal horse, but directly in a decorative fountain that the city had installed. Near the horse guards building, the splash was enormous, sending water cascading in all directions and soaking several nearby tourists who had been filming the entire spectacle. The crowd erupted in cheers and applause as Tommy surfaced from the fountain, sputtering and completely drenched. His carefully styled hair was plastered to his head, his clothes were soaked through, his dignity was somewhere at the bottom of the fountain, along with several decades' worth of coins thrown by wishful tourists. That's not how I remember learning to ride, Tommy called out weakly, sitting in the shallow fountain water and trying to process what had just happened. The cold water had shocked some of the alcohol out of his system. And for the first time that evening, he was beginning to realize that maybe his plan hadn't been as brilliant as he had thought. Britannia, meanwhile, stood calmly beside her fountain, looking down at the soggy tourist with an expression that could only be described as smug satisfaction. Her ears were forward now, alert and pleased, as if she was quite proud of her problem-solving skills. Trooper Harrison allowed himself a small, barely visible smile. His horse had handled the situation with exactly the kind of creative professionalism that made the household cavalry famous around the world. No one had been seriously hurt. The drunk tourist had been effectively neutralized. Britannia had demonstrated why she was considered one of the finest military horses in service. The security personnel who had finally responded to Harrison's earlier call arrived just in time to see Tommy attempting to climb out of the fountain. They took one look at the soaking wet tourist, the completely calm horse, and the crowd of laughing spectators, and immediately understood what had transpired. "Right then," said the lead security officer, trying very hard not to smile as he approached the fountain. "I think we need to have a little chat about appropriate tourist behavior, don't we?" Tommy's friends, Declan and Mick, finally overcame their shock and rushed forward to help their sodden companion out of the water. They had spent the entire incident torn between horror at their friend's behavior and amazement at his sheer audacity. "Hey, Tommy, you absolute madman," Declan said as he pulled his friend to his feet. "Are you trying to get us all banned from the United Kingdom?" "I think," Tommy said slowly, water dripping from his clothes and creating a puddle on the cobblestones, "I may have underestimated that horse." The crowd continued to film and photograph as security escorted Tommy away for what would undoubtedly be a very educational conversation about respecting military personnel, understanding the difference between tourist attractions and working animals, and the importance of knowing one's limits when alcohol is involved. As they walked away, Tommy looked back over his shoulder at Britannia one last time. The magnificent horse was standing calmly at her post, having returned to her duties as if nothing unusual had happened. Her rider had resumed his ceremonial position, and the evening routine continued exactly as it had for centuries.
"You know,"
"What?" Tommy said to his friends as they disappeared into the London night. "I think that horse might be smarter than I am." "Might be?" Mick replied incredulously. "Tommy, that horse just outsmarted you so badly that you ended up taking a bath in a public fountain. There's no might be about it." The video of Tommy's spectacular failure went viral within hours, shared across social media platforms with captions celebrating Britannia's tactical superiority over the overconfident tourist. The footage showed everything from Tommy's initial approach to his dramatic splash landing, creating a perfect cautionary tale about the dangers of combining alcohol with poor decision-making. Back at the Horse Guards, Britannia had already forgotten about Tommy Walsh entirely. She had more important things to think about, like when her next meal would be served, and whether the weather would be suitable for tomorrow's ceremonial duties. In her mind, she had simply dealt with a minor workplace annoyance in the most efficient way possible. Trooper Harrison, however, would remember the incident for years to come. It would become one of his favorite stories to tell new recruits about the importance of trusting your horse's judgment and the creative ways that military animals could handle difficult situations. Tommy Walsh returned to Dublin 2 days later, with a legendary hangover, a viral internet presence he never wanted, and a new understanding of why military horses deserve respect. His wedding to Sarah went ahead as planned. though his bachelor party story became the most talked about part of the reception. The moral of his London adventure was clear. When a horse says no, it's usually best to listen.